Okay, in this little video we're going to start talking about basics of networking. We'll begin by looking at the World Wide Web, that is, pages in a browser. I'll start with a simple site, this site here, and looking at what actually happens to get this page to load on my computer. I'm in Firefox here. We can look at the actual network traffic that goes back and forth. Tools, Web Developer, and Network. And if I load the page again, we see here, let's do a refresh. So we'll see here what actually has to get transferred back and forth. So each row here is an individual request that was made to get something. So the first one here is to get the HTML, and the second one is to get this picture up here. If we click on it, over here some information about what the browser asked for and what the server responded with. Here's the response, which is just the HTML code. And if we click on the picture, the response is the picture itself. Over here on the HTML, there's really more than comes back than just the HTML. There's some extra information that comes to the browser, and that is given here. So the this is all information about the server. So the server that's sending this web page is in Nginx, whatever that is, and so that was the response from the server. The request was this: I'm asking for kennyjeff.com, and this is information about the web browser and what it can handle. Alright, so let's take another example. Let's go to indstate.edu. Well, first let's do this one again and just pay attention to how long does it take to load. There's a little right here, there's half a second. Took 2 requests, transferred a total of 53 kilobytes. If we click on one of these, again, 2 requests, 70 kilobytes, 0.3 seconds. Let's try ISU's main page. It's taking some time. Things are still loading. Now we can see the page. There's still some stuff coming in. Still stuff coming in. Okay, so for all of that to happen, it transferred 95 individual requests and 3 megabytes. So some of these are pictures. So if we look at that as a tiny picture that is somewhere in the page to make it look just right. And you can see some of these are sent over a secure HTTPS and some of them are not. Somewhere in here there should be HTML, so there will be some HTML, and you can see that something's coming from Google, something's coming from Twitter, something's coming from DoubleClick, lots of stuff there. Let's take another example. Google.com. Okay, so this one was somewhere in between. There's 18 requests and it took 8 seconds. Okay, now we want to get a picture of what actually has to happen. So far what we're seeing is that there's the web browser is asking, this line here, the web browser is asking google.com for a web page. Let's look up a picture. I have one saved here. Okay, so this is one picture of what's happening. The client would be Firefox, our browser, and the server would be Google. And these lines here would be traffic that's going over the internet. And this picture is showing two different types of requests. One where you make a request and the server just sends back a file. That would be like KinneyJeff.com. I know what's happening on that server with this file, and it's just a plain HTML file, and all that happens is the server sends back the HTML, and then the browser is in charge of displaying it. And how that happens is the topic of a web programming course. Alright, that's one option here if the request is for a static page, one that does not change every time it's loaded. The other option is for a dynamic page, and this flowchart here is showing that the server will do some processing before sending some information back. And that would be google.com. It will load differently, potentially every time you load it. Up here, it knows that I'm logged in because it's saved that information from earlier. And then if you have it customized, you'll have some things loading down here. If we look at ISU's main page, this information here changes regularly, and there's other information here that changes regularly. And so that would be every time somebody loads that page, potentially something has to run on the server to decide what exactly to send. Alright, so on this picture we see a server and we see a client, and we can see that sometimes the server will just send back something directly, and other times it will run a process. Okay, so that's one image. Note dynamic pages. PHP, JSP, ASP. Those are all types of files that normally will be dynamic. And typically, if you have a file that's an image, or an HTML file, PDF, those will be static. That when you request something that's of that type. Okay, let's see a little bit more about the life of a web page between server and browser. So there's a suggestion here. We can search for other images. And you'll see lots of different flow charts. This one here, and we're not going to get quite into this much detail yet, but we will. This one here is showing a particular type of interaction, particular protocol, that's TCP, whatever TCP stands for. Okay, so this will go under the terms to know in the next section. TCP, IP, and others. Alright, we're not going to get into that yet. I'd like to put in just one more piece that happens that you might not think of. And we'll just, so this one here would be an example that shows an extra interaction. So here we have a laptop that's asking for a web page, and before you can get to the web page, so before I can get to kennyjeff.com, the first step is that it has to be translated into an address that internet routers and switches understand. So internet routers and switches do not understand what kennyjeff.com means. They need to figure it out. And the part that figures it out is called a domain name server. So domain name server converts a text URL into a numerical address. I'm going to put that in here. So a typical interaction to get a web page. One, user types a URL and enter in the web browser. So that is on the client. Two, the client makes a request to a DNS server to convert the URL into an IP address. So that could take multiple communications between the client, the web browser, and the operating system that web browser is running on, and the DNS server, which is some server sitting out there. Okay, and once we know the IP address, the client web browser sends a request to the web server for the page, for the URL, and last, the web server sends a response to the web page. And this picture here shows the different computers that are involved. So you have the client, potentially a laptop up here, DNS server that converts the address, and then the actual page is sitting out there somewhere. And all of this goes by certain rules. Note, each of those steps follows a protocol. Let's look at step 3. So step 3 is the part that we see when we look in our network developer tools. And I say get kennyjeff.com, and this here is what starts it all. And if we look at this, says that the web browser is sending a request that's get. Let's look at the raw. So the web browser sends the actual text get, and then this URL, and then this information about the request. So it's sending some text where it's combining this stuff into text, and that's going to be governed by rules of HTTP. The GET request is in a text format governed by the rules of HTTP. Okay, so that is what the web browser sees. So the web browser wants to send this text to the server, and the server is this address. That's where kennyjeff.com lives. So you want to send that information. The web browser shouldn't have to deal with how that information actually gets sent. So the way it works is you tell the operating system to go ahead and send it for you, and the protocol that we use there is TCP. So the web browser wants to send the GET request to the web server. This is sent using TCP, which the operating system is in charge of. And the TCP is one of these other pictures that we saw. This one here. So the operating system is doing some series of interactions between, this would be the client operating system and this would be the web server. So there's some sequence of interactions that happen to make sure that the request gets to the server and then the server sends the response, which is going to be the HTML page. Okay, and it's really using TCP, which itself uses the Internet Protocol, which the OS is, all that happens TCP/IP. So the server, let's see, the client OS wants to send TCP/IP information, and this is handled by the network card and the firmware device driver and firmware for the network card. Okay, so there's yet more rules. Note many layers of protocols. And if you want to look, so one of the other links here in the resources is the Wikipedia page on Internet protocols. This is just a bunch of Internet protocols here. This would be good reading. And we'll see some pictures here. There's a nice picture, not in there. Any of these pictures shows multiple layers, and we'll talk about it more later. So the application would be a web browser. So web browser is sitting up here, wants to send some information. It's going to use the TCP protocol, which itself sits on top of something called IP, which has to go to an Ethernet card, which will connect to some other device, which will connect to some other device along the internet, and eventually it'll get to a web browser, to a web server. Okay, so all of these things would be involved with getting the request for a web page and getting the web page back. These will all be terms that we want to look at in more detail. Okay, let's say that's going to be the end of this video, just a little tour of what it takes to get a web page from one side to another. And we haven't really talked about the details, but you're ready to do some reading.